this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's program. In this week's program, we're in our fifth and final session of our ongoing series entitled The Apportionment Black Belt. And before we get into the topic of today's material, let's just review some of the topics that we've handled so far. Now, it's my opinion that this is the most complete course on apportionment that you'll find anywhere. And I can say that with confidence because I myself have been to many QME continuing education seminars. And while it's common for apportionment to be discussed in these seminars, you rarely get more than 45 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes on the discussion of apportionment. And this program, the Apportionment Black Belt, we've had over 6 hours of discussion about issues related to apportionment, and really I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this complex and oftentimes difficult topic. The reason that I decided to move forward on this program is because many doctors tell me that apportionment is something that they find very difficult. They don't understand some of the issues surrounding apportionment, and they struggle in coming up with their approximate percentages of the permanent impairment related to the industrial injury and the approximate percentages of impairment due to other factors. And doctors will call me up and they'll say, how do I do it? How do I decide my approximate percentages? How do I figure out how to handle the apportionment determination? And so it seems that doctors really struggle with apportionment more than any other section of the report. So I thought that it was essential that we go over some of the issues related to apportionment. Now, the philosophy of this program is that the apportionment determination is actually very simple. And the reason that the apportionment determination is simple is because if you spend some time and do a certain number of examinations, you'll find that the apportionment themes begin to recur. In other words, there are recurring themes related to apportionment. And over time, if you do enough exams, you'll discover that there's really only 5 or 6 or 7 recurring themes that basically handle 99% of all your cases. So if you can simply get a handle on and understand the finite number of recurring themes related to apportionment, well, you'll have the apportionment determination whipped from now until forever. So with that as our philosophy, we began in session 1 of this program by talking about labor codes 4663 and 4664, which are our new labor codes that we rely on to guide us through our apportionment determination. And these are new labor codes that came about with the passage of Senate Bill 899 in 2004 and really changed the entire scheme with relationship to apportionment. And since I've researched and come to study labor codes 4663 and 4664, I've really come to appreciate how these new labor codes actually help to serve the legislature's intent at the time, which was to help control skyrocketing costs in workers' compensation. So these labor codes were passed as part of Emergency Regulation Senate Bill 899 to help control skyrocketing costs. And properly used, these labor codes actually do help to control skyrocketing costs. The purpose of these labor codes is to limit the liability of the employer to only that portion of the permanent impairment that's due as a direct result of the industrial injury. And that is totally fair. The employer should be liable and should be required to pay only for the portion of the permanent impairment that's the direct result of the industrial injury. And that's the entire purpose of these two labor codes. Now, these two labor codes specifically demand that we as qualified medical evaluators take a hard and detailed and focused look at the impact of prior industrial injuries on the current impairment due to a subsequent industrial injury. In other words, the apportionment labor codes really ask us to take a hard look at prior industrial injuries. In fact, prior industrial injuries are mentioned in both Labor Code 4663 and 4664. So, on that note, in our second session, we talked about how to handle the apportionment determination in an examinee who has had a prior industrial injury when that prior industrial injury settled by way of compromise and release. And this is a fascinating discussion because we frequently encounter these types of examinees. Examinees come to us and they have a history of prior industrial injuries, and you'll see in the medical records that the case settled by compromise and release, and nowhere are we taught how to handle the apportionment determination in these types of examinees. So we spent about an hour talking about the compromise and release, the philosophy of settling claims by compromise and release, and how a compromise and release compares to an award of permanent disability with regards to the apportionment determination. Then in session 3, we continued the theme of the apportionment determination in examinees who have had a prior industrial injury. And in session 3, we shifted gears to talk about how to handle the apportionment determination in an examinee who has had a prior industrial injury when that prior industrial injury has settled not by compromise and release, but in this case has settled by way of permanent disability award. And Labor Code 4664 specifically mentions prior awards of permanent disability. And the take-home message from that discussion, and I hope this settled in to your deep introspection. What does it mean that an examinee has a prior award of permanent disability? Well, Labor Code 4664 tells us that the prior award of permanent disability, the prior permanent disability exists and persists into perpetuity. In other words, an examinee cannot claim medical rehabilitation from a prior industrial injury if that industrial injury settled by way of permanent disability award. So the permanent disability and all of its factors and all of its components and all of its subjective complaints and all of its positive physical examination objective findings and all of its limitations to activities of daily living and all of its associated work restrictions that existed at the time of the award of permanent disability exist and persist into perpetuity. What that means is that by the time this examinee, an examinee who has received an award of prior permanent disability, by the time that examinee has a subsequent new second industrial injury, at that time they were already damaged goods. They were already a wreck. They already had pain. They already had subjective complaints. They already had limitations to activities of daily living. They already had positive objective findings. They already had work restrictions. So when the examinee comes to you for evaluation of the subsequent injury, don't be surprised when they tell you about problems, and more problems. Labor Code 4664 tells us that those problems exist and persist into perpetuity. In session 4, we continued by talking about how to handle another large group of examinees that we frequently see, and that is examinees that have, number one, pre-existing conditions, either symptomatic or asymptomatic conditions. And we agreed and concluded that the law allows for apportionment of permanent impairment when that permanent impairment is contributed to by even asymptomatic pre-existing conditions. In other words, even conditions that are asymptomatic at the time of an industrial injury, that asymptomatic condition can contribute to the permanent impairment, and in which case the amount of permanent impairment due to that pre-existing condition needs to be apportioned out. And this is important because we see all the time examinees who present with asymptomatic or even symptomatic pre-existing conditions. I mean, almost everyone has some sort of pre-existing condition that could conceivably contribute to the permanent impairment. So that was the first part of session 4. And then in part 2 of session 4, we talked about how to handle examinees who have claims for simultaneous injuries. So typically we'll see a simultaneous claim for number 1, a specific injury, and number 2, a cumulative trauma injury. And we concluded that when those injuries become permanent and stationary at the same time, and the examinee has permanent impairment, that the examinee qualifies for a permanent impairment due to 2 separate industrial injuries. And the permanent impairment is apportioned between the 2 separate injuries. On rare occasion, it will not be possible to apportion between the 2 injuries. In those cases, the examinee will qualify for a single award of permanent impairment, and that single award of permanent impairment may provide for them greater compensation than the award for 2 separate but equivalent but smaller awards. And we talked about how the Benson case and how to do a Benson analysis on examinees who are claiming 2 simultaneous industrial injuries. So with those 4 sessions alone, we handled a great bulk of the cases that you're going to see as a qualified medical evaluator. So those types of cases we already know how to handle, and so the very next time that you get one of those cases, boom, your apportionment determination will be a cinch because we've discussed about how to handle it at length. Well, the remaining cases that you're going to see might seem to be the more difficult kind of cases that don't neatly fit into those first 3 or 4 different types of criteria that we discussed. But actually, the remaining cases that you're going to see are not difficult cases. They're actually very simple cases, and they fall into a very neat algorithm for preparing your apportionment determination. I'm going to share that algorithm with you here today. So in session 5 today, the philosophy of today's discussion has to do with how do you handle those cases which represent a large bulk of the cases that you're going to see that do not involve prior industrial injuries that settle by compromise and release or that settle by way of permanent disability award. How do you handle those cases that do not involve pre-existing conditions, whether those be symptomatic or asymptomatic? How do you handle those cases that don't involve 2 simultaneous injuries? How do you handle the other cases? Are these other cases much more difficult and hard to decide on the apportionment determination percentages? No. Actually, the remaining bulk of cases represent the simple cases, and I'm going to show you today how simple they really are. And just to give you a little preview into today's discussion, let me ask you, when interviewing your examinee in the face-to-face evaluation, when you sit down with the examinee and you begin discussing the history of their industrial injury, would you agree with me that there are some lines of questioning that are more important than other lines of questioning? That makes sense, correct? I'm sure you would agree with me on that. Well, that raises the question. With regards to the apportionment determination, okay, we're not even talking here about the causation determination. We're not talking about the permanent impairment determination and formulation. We're not talking about the determination on the need for or against future medical care. We're not talking about that. We're limiting our focus here to the apportionment determination. And with regards to the apportionment determination, what would be an important line of questioning for your examinee? Well, I'll just give you a preview to today's discussion. The most important, let me repeat that, the most important line of questioning with regards to apportionment, which you're going to have to discuss in the days and weeks after your examinee leaves your office. You're going to be responsible for producing your report, which will contain an opinion on apportionment of the permanent impairment. At that time, days and weeks later, after the examinee has left your office, you will wish that you thoroughly questioned your examinee about the most important topic, the most important issue that factors into your apportionment determination, and that is the mechanism of the injury. So in today's discussion, I want to elaborate fully on the importance of the mechanism of injury and how you can use what we refer to as the mechanism of injury continuum in arriving at your permanent impairment determination. And this is a critical lesson that you will not find discussed anywhere else. So I'm glad you're with me here today. I want you to pay close attention to today's topic, because this, more than any other topic that we've discussed so far, will help you successfully handle your apportionment determination in a way that makes you look reasonable, that makes you look credible, and your opinion will certainly qualify as substantial medical evidence. So I look forward to being back with you here in just a couple moments as we begin today's important discussion on apportionment related to the mechanism of injury continuum. Talk to you about what seems to be probably one of the most difficult challenges that doctors face in producing their QME reports, and that has to do with the apportionment determination. The apportionment determination. So let's talk a little bit today about apportionment. First thing I want to say is that this is actually our second discussion on apportionment. In our very last series, which was entitled The Update on the QME Regulations, I spent quite a bit of time talking about apportionment as relates to two labor codes. Labor codes 4663 and 4664. So I'm going to provide a reference in today's blog that allows you to quickly access that discussion for those of you that are extremely motivated and want to learn more about apportionment. So between that discussion and today's discussion on apportionment, we should be able to handle 99% of any of the difficult cases that come across your desk and any of the difficult apportionment determinations that you would otherwise struggle with. So a couple key words about apportionment. Apportionment applies in those cases wherein you determine that the examinee has permanent disability. Now, it's our obligation as qualified medical evaluators that when we opine for permanent disability, or I should say permanent impairment, our obligation is that we then must, and that's all caps, which means that it's a requirement, we must provide an apportionment determination. And the apportionment determination provides our opinion of the amount of permanent impairment that's due as a direct result of the industrial injury, that's number one, and the amount of the permanent impairment, if any, that's due to what are referred to as other factors. Now, the employer or the claims administrator is responsible only to compensate the examinee for the portion of permanent impairment directly due to the industrial injury. They're not responsible to reimburse the examinee for any permanent impairment that's unrelated or not directly due to the industrial injury. And that makes sense. That makes sense. So in cases where the injured worker is represented, it is the obligation of the applicant, meaning the examinee and the applicant attorney, to argue and to twist your elbow about your determination of the permanent impairment that's due to the industrial injury. The examinee and the applicant attorney are going to attempt to maximize the permanent impairment that's due directly to the industrial injury. So once you provide your opinion on the apportionment due to the industrial injury, you can be prepared to have to defend that opinion to the applicant attorney, either by way of supplemental report or by way of deposition. And those parties are going to twist your elbow to increase the amount of permanent impairment due to the industrial injury. Now, on the other hand, it's the obligation of the defense attorney to do the exact opposite. The defense attorney is going to twist your elbow and is going to demand that you defend your opinion on the permanent impairment due to other factors. Other factors would include things like prior permanent impairments, prior asymptomatic pre-existing conditions, retroactive prophylactic work restrictions, subsequent non-industrial injuries, and anything that contributes to the permanent impairment aside and apart from the industrial injury could qualify as an other factor. There's no limit to the number of other factors that the defense attorney is going to ask you to consider and to include or consider in your apportionment determination. So you can expect the defense attorney to ask you and demand that you defend your permanent impairment opinion due to other factors, and they're going to try and maximize the percentage of permanent impairment due to other factors. So doctors call me all the time and they ask me and they say, how do I decide how much of the permanent impairment is due to the injury and how much is due to other factors? How do I come up with my approximate percentages? Approximate percentages. How do I do that? And that's where the whole crux of the matter and the difficulty with apportionment lies. So I want to talk to you about a couple of principles and a couple of procedures that you can employ in formulating an apportionment determination that is reasonable, that makes sense, that is consistent and congruent with the facts of the case, and that ultimately qualifies as an opinion or conclusion that the parties can rely on. And by that, I'm simply stating that your opinion and conclusion qualifies as what we refer to as substantial medical evidence. Okay? So in order to more completely understand apportionment and the process involved with coming up with those approximate percentages, we need to talk about the mechanism of injury. The mechanism of injury. Now, before we get into that, let me just say that when I talk with many doctors on the phone or by email about their apportionment determination, I find that a discussion of the mechanism of injury is frequently lacking in the doctor's formulation. And when I inquire to the doctor as to the mechanism of injury, most of the time doctors are unable to elaborate on the mechanism of the injury. Now, one of the key take-home messages from today's video is that the mechanism of injury is critical. The mechanism of injury is a key historic data, The mechanism of injury is one of the areas in your interview of the examinee that you want to explore in great detail. There are few issues as important as the mechanism of injury. And I find that doctors in their interview and history taking of examinee many times go down unnecessary and unrelated rabbit trails And they go down those trails in great detail. When those trails and that line of questioning is not in any way going to contribute to opinions and conclusions later on in the completion of the report. So it brings up an interesting question. Okay, so what are some of the key data upon which you're going to rely for the opinions and conclusions of your report? Well, without getting into all of those, and perhaps that's material for a future discussion, let's just say for purposes of today's video discussion that the mechanism of injury is one of the key data points. Let me repeat that. The mechanism of injury is one of the key data points. Now, when we talk about causation in another video, what's another key data point with regards to causation? I find many doctors do not interview accurately with regards to causation. Just to illustrate the importance of the mechanism of injury and the fact that it's a key data point, let's analogize that to a discussion of causation. When you're discussing causation and the injury with the injured worker, what's a key data point? What would be a key interview question with regards to causation? How about, was the injury witnessed? Was there a witness present, Mrs. Jones? Mrs. Jones is telling you all about how she slipped off the edge of the curb at work. What's a key data point? Who saw you do that, Mrs. Jones? Was this a witnessed incident? Okay? It's a key data point with regards to the causation determination. Well, with regards to the apportionment determination, a key data point upon which you must have many, many details and great understanding is the mechanism of injury. So when you're interviewing the examinee, probe into the mechanism of injury. You must be fluent in describing the mechanism of injury. The mechanism of injury is data upon which your apportionment determination is going to be based. Your apportionment determination has to be congruent and consistent with the mechanism of injury. Okay? And let me just give you an example here. And I love this discussion because it's based on so much great history and great cases in the workers' compensation system. And the case that we referred to that gives us so much principle related to our apportionment determination is the Escobedo case. Now, I have the Escobedo case here for reference, and I also have it available for you by way of a link that you can click on today's blog, and you can have access to the Escobedo decision as well. Well, let's just put this in perspective. So, Marlene Escobedo was a sales associate at Marshall's clothing store. You've all probably either been in a Marshall's clothing store or you know about a Marshall's clothing store. It's a clothing store. Okay, she was working in a clothing store. And she slipped and fell one day and she injured her left knee. Well, the left knee ultimately required a partial meniscectomy procedure. And as a result of the injury to the left knee and the surgery to the left knee, she began to favor the right knee, or she began to compensate with the right knee in order to favor the left knee. Well, she very quickly developed symptoms in the right knee. She didn't fall simply as a result of favoritism and gait alteration. She quickly developed symptoms in the right knee. So she had a specific injury to the left knee and a compensable consequence injury to the right knee. Okay, now let's focus in for a minute on the mechanism of these injuries. The left knee was injured as a result of a specific fall where she was coming down some steps and she fell directly on her knee. Now, that type of an injury is a specific injury that's much more severe than the other injury, the compensable consequence right knee injury. The right knee injury was simply the result of repetitive and cumulative overuse for favoring the painful left. So the specific injury was a more severe injury. The cumulative trauma or compensable consequence injury was a less severe injury. And the qualified medical evaluator referred to the injury, the compensable consequence injury, he referred to that as a trivial injury. So let me just read to you what the qualified medical evaluator said about that injury. And this comes directly from his apportionment determination. He says, Ms. Escobedo's left knee residuals are directly related to the industrial injury. The applicant developed right knee problems as a derivative of the left knee, and not as a result of any subsequent cumulative trauma. He says, in my opinion, there is a medically reasonable basis for apportionment given the trivial nature of the injury that occurred and the almost immediate onset of right knee symptoms that occurred shortly after the left knee injury. So he described the injury to the right knee as a trivial injury. Trivial. So this raises the concept of the continuum of the mechanism of injury. And what I want you to do is I want you to start categorizing the mechanism of injury that your examinee suffered, categorizing that as either a mild injury. Now this evaluator described injuries on this end of the continuum. He described it as trivial. So we can use the word trivial, we can use the word mild, whatever. Trivial or mild, and then moderate, and then at the other end of the spectrum, severe injuries. Severe injuries. This represents a continuum or a spectrum of mechanism of injuries, all the way from trivial to severe. So what would be an example of a trivial injury? How about the repetitive trauma injuries? How about cumulative trauma injuries? How about compensable consequence injuries? Those would be over on the trivial side. What would be an example of a severe injury? How about the guy that falls from the scaffold from the 3rd story while he's washing windows and falls 3 stories flat onto his back? That would be what we call a severe injury. What would be then therefore a moderate injury? Moderate injury would be somewhere between the two ends of those extremes. Now it's the mechanism of injury that's going to be critical in arriving at your apportionment determination. So what I want to do now is I want to go to the whiteboard and put up some hypothetical scenarios considering the mechanism of injury spectrum and how the mechanism of injury relates to the approximate percentages of permanent impairment that you ascribe, number 1, to the industrial injury, and then number 2, the approximate percentages that you ascribe to other factors. So let's take a brief break right here while I get out the whiteboard, and I look forward to being back with you in just a minute as we consider today's discussion on the nuts and bolts of apportionment. So remember, when you're doing your interview with the examinee, you want to explore the mechanism of injury. 100 questions regarding the mechanism of injury. From how high did you fall? What did you land on? What side of your body did you land on? Did you feel any cracks? Was there any pops? Where did you feel pain? Did you stumble over any objects? Did you hit any objects? 100 questions. Because later on, your mechanism of injury is going to contribute to your opinions and conclusions, not the least of which is your apportionment determination. Okay? So what I want you to do is I want you to consider a mechanism of injury continuum. And I hope you can see this. This continuum ranges from the trivial injuries on this side all the way to the severe injuries on this side. And then moderate injuries would be somewhere in the middle. Okay? So let's begin with a discussion of the severe mechanism of injury. Imagine you have a rodeo bull rider. And the rodeo bull rider gets thrown off the bull and then subsequently gets stomped into pieces by the bull. And these bulls average around 1 ton, 2,000 pounds is a standard rodeo bull. And the guy suffers multiple bone fractures, ruptured spleen, pneumothorax, and all these severe injuries. He's hospitalized with fractures and requires extensive medical treatment for about a year. At the end of the year, he's found to have some residuals and some permanent impairment. The question becomes, how much of the permanent impairment is due to the industrial injury and how much of the permanent impairment is due to other factors? Well, let's consider the mechanism of injury. The mechanism of injury was severe. He was stomped by a 2,000-pound rodeo bull. This qualifies as a severe mechanism of injury in contrast to a repetitive trauma injury where an injured worker works on an assembly line and has repetitive upper extremity motions as an example. Okay? So this was a severe mechanism of injury all the way over on this end of the spectrum. Now the question becomes, would this mechanism of injury that the rodeo bull rider suffered, would this mechanism of injury cause a same or similar permanent impairment in any other person? In any other person. Now, rodeo bull riders are generally younger people, 20 or 30 years old, so they don't have a lot of degenerative change. They don't have a lot of pre-existing conditions, although I guess they could. They don't have retroactive prophylactic work restrictions as a bull rider. And so, because this mechanism of injury, being severely stomped by a rodeo bull, would also cause same or similar impairment in any other person, you can safely conclude that a large percentage, maybe 100%, was due to the industrial injury, and 0% due to other factors. Like what other factors? Pre-existing degenerative change. Let's say, for example, this person had some permanent impairment of the lumbar spine, and X-ray studies immediately after the injury showed the presence of osteophytes of L4, L5. How do those osteophytes and that degenerative change contribute to the permanent impairment in any way when the guy was severely stomped by a 2,000-pound rodeo bull? Can you see how silly and incongruent it would be to say, in my opinion, 50% of the permanent impairment was due to the industrial injury, and 50% was due to pre-existing degenerative change, because X-rays showed that he had some osteophytes at L5 and S1. Okay? Those osteophytes do not in any way contribute to the permanent impairment related to this severe mechanism of injury. In other words, this mechanism of injury of being stomped by a 2,000-pound rodeo bull would cause similar impairment in any other person, regardless of age, regardless of condition of the lumbar spine. Even if he had advanced degenerative change of the lumbar spine, that person would suffer similar impairment because the mechanism of injury was so severe. Okay? Now, on the other hand, when we go to the trivial end of the spectrum, we may have, for example, let's consider a compensable consequence injury of the cervical spine following a right shoulder surgical procedure. In other words, we have an examinee who had a right shoulder surgery, and over time, as a result of limiting the use of the right shoulder due to pain, due to surgical hardware, etc., the examinee develops symptoms of the cervical spine. We could call those symptoms consistent with muscle guarding. Muscle guarding qualifies as a permanent impairment, if indeed it's a permanent condition. Okay? So we have a permanent impairment of the cervical spine related to muscle guarding. How much of the permanent impairment is due to the industrial injury, which involved an injury to the right shoulder, and how much is due to other factors? You have to ask yourself, would this mechanism of injury of favoring the right shoulder, would that mechanism of injury cause similar impairment in any other person? Are there any persons in the world that have a right shoulder surgery that favor their right arm because of pain and surgical hardware that then do not go on to develop muscle guarding of the cervical spine? There are those people, aren't there? If there are those people. So what's the difference between a person who does not develop the muscle guarding and a person who develops muscle guarding? It must be due to other factors, because not everyone who has shoulder surgery develops a permanent impairment of the cervical spine. So with trivial injuries, you may opine that 0% of the permanent impairment is due to the industrial injury. Industrial injury. And maybe as much as 100% due to other factors. Now, that might be a little bit overstated in this example. In this example, if the examinee never had the industrial injury to the right shoulder, she probably never would have had muscle guarding of the cervical spine. But you could also opine that even absent the industrial injury to the shoulder, she would have developed symptoms with the cervical spine by the permanent and stationary date anyway, even if she never had the industrial injury. And you could base that conclusion on X-ray studies that show perhaps advanced degenerative change of the cervical spine, advanced spinal stenosis, advanced neuroforaminal stenosis, advanced degeneration of the uncinate joints of Luschka. In other words, you could opine that even if she did not have the industrial injury to the right shoulder, she would have, by this date and time, would have had at least some muscle guarding of the cervical spine equivalent to the same permanent impairment, and in your opinion, it's 100% unrelated to the industrial injury, and it's 100% related to other factors. So this represents the range of our possibilities, from 0% industrial to 100% industrial, from 100% due to other factors, and 0% due to other factors. Now, most of the cases that we're going to find are going to fall somewhere in between. They're going to fall into the moderate type of injury with some other distribution of the percentage. So towards this end of the spectrum, we have 0% industrial. Over here we have 100% industrial. Over here we have 100% due to other factors. And here we have 0% due to other factors. And I hope you can see that. And here, this would be 90-10. This would be 80-20, 70-30, 60-40, 50-50, 40-60, 30-70, 20-80, 10 and 90. And you're going to see a bell-shaped distribution like so. So it basically comes down to the mechanism of injury. So when you're making your apportionment determination, you need to qualify the injury as trivial, moderate, or severe. And some of the things that you need to consider when you come up with your apportionment determination is, like we already alluded to, would this injury cause permanent impairment to a similar or same extent in any other person? If the answer to that question is yes, then you're leaning more towards 100% due to the industrial injury. If the answer to that question is no, this injury would not cause same similar impairment in any other person. The reason it caused impairment in this person, in my specific examinee, is because she has A, B, C, D, E, all these other factors. They're called other factors. We can simply summarize and synopsize all these things, such as pre-existing degenerative change, such as retroactive prophylactic work restrictions, such as prior industrial injuries, such as subsequent trauma. All these things that contribute to permanent impairment, we refer to those as other factors. So if, in your opinion, this injury, because it was so trivial, such a trivial injury such as a repetitive trauma, cumulative trauma, compensable consequence, it was so trivial that it would not cause permanent impairment in any other person. Well, why is it causing permanent impairment in this person? That's the question. Well, the reason is because she has so many other factors going on. So that's one question to consider. Another major question to consider is what impact or what benefit would you expect treatment to provide to the examinee over a period of time? So let me rephrase that another way. If you had an examinee who had, an injury that you would describe as moderate, and that examinee is provided with what you agree is adequate and appropriate medical treatment, would you expect that examinee to get better with time and treatment? Would you expect them to get better with time and treatment? Okay, most people with time and appropriate treatment get better. That's the purpose of the treatment. If they're not going to get any better, why give them treatment? So if your examinee has had adequate treatment, in your opinion, would you expect them to get better? The answer to that is generally yes. So if the examinee does not respond to treatment, is that a typical response for most examinees? And the answer is no. Most examinees generally respond to adequate and appropriate treatment. So if the examinee does not respond, why do they not respond? Why do they have high level of permanent impairment in the context of adequate and appropriate treatment? Why would that be? The reason for that can only be because they have so many other factors going on that are preventing them from getting well. Such as what? Such as a prior permanent disability. Such as prior multiple auto accident injuries to the cervical spine. Such as prior pre-existing, either asymptomatic or symptomatic, degenerative change of the cervical spine. What's preventing them from responding to treatment, and thereby causing them to have high levels of permanent impairment in the context of adequate and appropriate treatment. It must be a high level of other factors. Okay? So you can use the mechanism of injury continuum in ascribing your approximate percentages of permanent impairment due to the industrial injury and the approximate percentage due to other factors. Okay? So let's take a quick break and we'll conclude with some final remarks. So let's provide some concluding remarks to today's discussion. And that is that the apportionment determination seems to be a choke point for many doctors, but it really should not be and doesn't need to be. Because you're only going to encounter a limited number of scenarios with your examinees. There's a finite number of scenarios that you're going to be encountering. And once you master the general principles of those basic scenarios, you'll have the apportionment determination whipped from that point on forward. Another of the major tenets that we described in our other video related to the QME regulations is that Labor Code 4664 also gives us great guidance in providing our apportionment determination. Labor Code 4664 says that if an applicant has received a prior award of permanent disability, that prior disability is presumed to exist at the time of any subsequent industrial injury. This is a major principle, and this applies to those examinees, the growing number of examinees that we're seeing that have prior industrial injuries and prior awards for permanent impairment. So the principle is, on the date of the second industrial injury, they already had a bad neck. They already had a bad shoulder. They already had a permanently impaired lumbar spine. They already had a permanently impaired lower extremity. The permanent disability exists at the time of any subsequent industrial injury. So when you provide your permanent impairment rating, the examinee qualifies only for permanent impairment that's above and beyond that which was already existing at the time. And so this tremendously simplifies the apportionment determination. It used to be that prior award for permanent disability, that prior permanent impairment percentage, could go away if the examinee had to demonstrate that if the examinee could demonstrate that they had rehabilitated themselves. Now, that prior disability does not go away. So if you have an examinee who, let's just say, has a 20% impairment for a spinal injury, and you find documentation that they had a prior award of 15% permanent impairment, you can safely say that 75% of the permanent impairment, that's 15% out of 20% total, that's 75%. 75% of the permanent impairment is due to other factors. Only 25% is due to the new industrial injury. A very simple apportionment determination. The other key principle comes from the Escobedo decision, and it has to do with the mechanism of injury. So become an expert in discovering as many facts as possible related to the mechanism of injury, because it's the mechanism of injury upon which you're going to rely later for your opinion and conclusion on the apportionment of the permanent impairment. Many doctors are omitting or forgetting to discover details about the mechanism of injury, and then when it comes time to provide the apportionment determination, they don't have the necessary facts upon which they can rely. And the mechanism of injury is one of the key facts upon which you do rely. And so when you get to the apportionment determination, you're going to reiterate in great detail the mechanism of injury. And the more severe the mechanism of injury, the more likely it is that the entirety of the permanent impairment is due to the industrial injury. On the other hand, the more trivial the injury, the more likely it is that the entirety of the permanent impairment is going to be due to other factors. And if you think about it, doesn't that make sense? If a person says that all they did was overuse their right lower extremity for a couple of weeks, but yet they have high level of permanent impairment on that lower extremity, the greater proportion of that impairment is due to other factors. It's not due to the injury, which was a trivial injury. And then on the other hand, the more severe the injury, the more likely it is that that type of an injury would cause a same or similar impairment in any other person, regardless of other factors, regardless of pre-existing degenerative change, regardless of retroactive prophylactic work restrictions, regardless of subsequent traumas. When you get stomped by a 2,000-pound rodeo bull, I don't care if you're Mr. America, you're going to suffer the same or similar injury as Mr. Sears and Roebuck in his mid-30s, Mr. Executive in his 40s, Mr. Farmer in his 50s. This permanent impairment is going to be roughly the same across all age spectrums, across all spinal condition spectrums, across all historic spectrums. That's a severe mechanism of injury that's going to cause same similar impairment regardless of other factors. So the bottom line and the take-home message on the apportionment determination really is that it all comes down to the mechanism of injury. Isn't that fascinating? And isn't that reassuringly simple? Doesn't that simplify your apportionment determination? You simply place the mechanism of injury along a spectrum from trivial to moderate to severe, and that taken together with other historic facts is going to allow you to very easily pinpoint the approximate percentages due to the injury and the approximate percentages due to other factors. So doctors, I hope this concept helps you. This is something that you can rely on for every single case from here on out. And you have every justification to hold your head high and to be proud and confident in your apportionment determination when it's solidly based upon an adequate history as relates to the mechanism of injury and an adequate exam that exactly complies with the requirements as described in the AMA guides. And when you elaborate in great detail on the mechanism of injury and support your opinion and conclusions with details from the mechanism of injury, your apportionment determination will largely be, number one, it will qualify as substantial medical evidence, and number two, it will basically be irrefutable. Although don't be surprised if the parties do try to refute your opinion, because as we said, that's their obligation. So doctors, I hope this helps you.